And I wonder, as we begin the year, do we find ourselves in the wilderness with very little bread? Do we find ourselves away from home? Not in Galilee, but in the Decapolis. And we have this homesickness in our hearts. Or perhaps some of us have homes here in Mississauga, in Oakville, or wherever we have homes in. But home has become a challenge. Home is not the home you used to know 10 or 20 years ago. And we are wondering, why are we so far away from home? And as we start the year, we wonder if we have enough resources to meet the challenges of home. Or some of us are blessed to start a new job, to get a new contract, and we have a new environment to work in. But as we go into that office place, that school place, that place in the gym, wherever God has called us, we find that we are not connecting with people there. And we find that we are among strangers. And right at this desert place, this place where we are so far away from home and we are with strangers, Jesus has the audacity to ask us, how many loaves do you have? And when we check around and see how many loaves do we have, we find we have only 7. Not the 500 to feed the 4,000. Or we find that we have only 5 loaves and 2 fish. Not the amount to feed 5,000 men plus women and children. And we find ourselves asking Jesus this same question. Where, God, in this desert, can we find bread? Where, God, in this remote place, can we find enough resources to meet the challenges of 2015? Let's be honest. Some of us have that challenge in our hearts. And then look at how Jesus meets the challenge of the wilderness. Because we look to Jesus as the prime example of meeting the challenges in the wilderness. And I invite you to read this verse with me that's found in Mark 1, 12 to 13, because this is, if you like, a summary of what Jesus does in the wilderness of his life. So let's read Mark 1, 12 to 13 right now. At once, the Spirit sent him out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness for 40 days, being tempted by Satan. He was with the wild animals, and angels attended him. Okay. Now, he had a mountaintop experience at his baptism, and it says here, immediately, at once, the Spirit sends him into the wilderness. And it's not, the interesting about this verse is that Jesus did not go into the wilderness by choice. The Spirit sent him there, which is actually a challenge for us in a wilderness experience right now. Did the Spirit send us there, or did we arrive at the wilderness by mistake, by accident? And yet, we have this period of 40 days in the wilderness, or the people of Israel 40 years in the wilderness, or Moses in the ark for 40 days. You have this period of testing that's found in the Bible, and it's usually a period of 40 days. And look, he is in the wilderness with wild animals. And you can count the number of wild animals in your life right now, can't you? All the struggles that you're going through right now. But also, there's a promise from God. God sends us angels to minister to us. And the word angels The Greek word angels in the Bible can mean either spiritual beings or human beings. You have to see the context to understand whether it's spiritual beings or, and I praise God for the angels in my life, the human angels. The spiritual beings, I usually cannot identify them. I want to tell you the story of Len. In the mid-1980s, my family moved to northern Saskatchewan to start a church. As a church planter, part of my support was funded by the local mission. Most months were difficult financially. One week in April, when the ground is still frozen and snow-covered, we were down to only a few dollars in the bank. Our usual reaction to that need was to look for our own solution. This time, however, in a stroke of faith, I went before God and told him that we needed eggs, bread, and milk. I could wait upon him. That afternoon, a man came to my little fix-it shop with a leaky tea kettle. He said, "I know I could get another, but it's my favorite kettle. Please fix it." In a matter of minutes, the job was done, and I didn't even charge him for it. But he pulled out a $10 bill and insisted that I take it, just enough to buy a gallon of milk, a dozen eggs, and a loaf of bread. As he left, I thank God from the bottom of my heart. And so God sends angels like this into our lives. And I believe that if God can bless land in the middle of northern Saskatchewan, he can bless us in the middle of Mississauga. But I'm not going to be the health and wealth preacher. I'm not going to be the name and claim it preacher. God calls us to wait on him, as Len says. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground, verse 6. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people, and they did so. We are trying to answer the blanks in study question number 5 now. So Jesus stretches them with these questions. How many loaves do you have? And it were just 7 loaves, and there were 4,000 people in front of them. Everyone is getting hungry and restless, and the disciples are even getting more hungry and restless, and they ask Jesus, they doubt Jesus and say, where in this desert place can we find food? And what does Jesus tell the crowds to do? He gets the crowd to sit down on the ground. He makes them sit down in the middle of nowhere, where there is no village for miles. And this is the difference between the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark 6 and the feeding of the 4,000 in Mark 8. In the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark 6, Jesus tells them to sit on the green grass. And to me, it was an allusion to Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. That's in Mark 6. But in Mark chapter 8 now, there is no green grass reported. Instead, he makes them sit down in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the desert, where there is no green grass. Jesus makes them sit down. And to me, this is a metaphor of waiting for God and sitting down in the middle of our wilderness, in the middle of our desert, in the middle of our remote place. Secondly, Jesus takes the bread and he gives thanks to God. Despite the crowd's restlessness and the disciples' lack of faith, Jesus doesn't look to the people, he looks up to God in heaven. And what does heaven do? Heaven sees their need and feeds them the bread. Bread of heaven. Feed us till we want no more. This picture in front of us in Mark 8 is not a new picture. God brings a big group of people in the wilderness. He teaches them many things. They are in the wilderness for a long time. They get hungry. It is the remote place. It is the wilderness. It is the desert. And they begin to doubt God. And they ask whether it's Moses or Jesus, where in this desert place can we find food? And despite their faithlessness, God still feeds them. The account of God feeding the 5,000 in Mark 6 and God feeding the 4,000 in Mark 8 has parallels with God feeding the people of Israel in the desert for 40 years when they were traveling before they reached the promised land. And in these cases, okay, whether it was 40 years in the wilderness or whether the disciples in the light of the 5,000 people in Mark 6 or the disciples in the light of the 4,000 people in Mark 8, they express doubts before God. Where in this desert place can we find food? We're in the middle of nowhere, God. We're in the middle of nowhere, Moses. We're in the middle of nowhere, Jesus. Where are we going to find food? And in these three cases, whether it's Moses or Jesus, they look up to heaven. And heaven feeds. The people of Israel in the wilderness, the 5,000 people in Mark 6, and the 4,000 people in Mark 8. And in the wilderness of the Old Testament, it is actually specifically said it is manna, bread from heaven. But in Mark 6, in the feeding of the 5,000, and in Mark 8, in the feeding of the 4,000, it is not stipulated to be manna, but in both situations, Jesus looks up to heaven and gives thanks for the bread. Again, a symbol that they are fed from heaven. But this leads us to the final truth that I feel is for us this morning. This morning, Jesus might ask you, how many loaves do you have? And you look into your lunch box and you see, Jesus, I have only 5 loaves and 2 fish. Or in some other situation, they don't have a lunch box. But Jesus asked us the same question, how many loaves do you have? And we look instead into our paper plate and we see that there are 7 loaves in it. Whether it's 5 loaves or 2 fish, not enough to feed 5,000 people, or 7 loaves without stipulation of any fish to feed 4,000 people, whatever it is, brothers and sisters, God takes the mere loaves we have this morning and multiplies it to feed the crowds. And I want to say the difference between these people and us sometimes is this. God blessed Israel in the wilderness. God blessed the 5,000 people in Mark 6, and God blessed the 4,000 people in Mark 6. They could see the people being fed. But I believe that if it's just praying for the people down the road there, or it's just talking to someone in the water cooler tomorrow as you go to work and finding out how did their struggle with their child was during the weekend, or when we go to school tomorrow and we are helping this person who is struggling in their homework, whatever it is, those small loaves of our lives, God will multiply to feed the crowd. And we might not see it, but God sees. And I think that's probably the thing that we need to remember when we don't see that God is blessing us. God sees and God is blessing. they had a few small fish as well. Mark 8:7. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. There is a difference between the giving thanks of the fish in the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark 6 and the giving thanks of the fish in the feeding of the 4,000 in Mark 8. In the feeding of the 5,000 in Mark 6, Jesus gave thanks for the bread and the fish together. However, in the feeding of the 4,000 in Mark 8, Jesus gives thanks for the bread, and then he tells his disciples to distribute, and they eat the bread first. And then after that, he sees the fish, he gives thanks for the fish, and then they distribute the fish. So the question is this: why does Jesus separate the act of giving thanks for the bread and the act of giving thanks for the fish in Mark 8? The answer is this: they are in the middle of Gentile territory. They're in the middle of the Decapolis. Because if you read in the foregoing chapter, this is what Jesus says to this Syrian Phoenician woman. And let me just say, we struggled with this passage, didn't we, when we looked at it 3 months ago or 2 months ago. First, let the children eat all they want, he told her. For it is not right to take the children's bread, the Jewish children's bread, and to toss it to the dogs. And this was a controversial statement because Jesus called a Gentile woman the dogs. Lord, she replied, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Then he told her, for such a reply you may go. The demon has left your daughter. Jesus is on a mission to non-Jewish Gentiles. He starts first with Tyre in the middle of Mark 7, and then he moves to the Decapolis in which he heals a deaf and mute person, again a symbol of the Gentiles now being able to speak of the words of God and to hear the words of God. And now he feeds a crowd of 4,000 people, and this is a metaphor for God blessing people in the wilderness that started in the Old Testament. And as he feeds the 4,000 people, there are Gentiles. There are non-Jewish people in this 4,000. This is the age of the new era in which God is blessing non-Jewish Gentile people. And we look at this Syrian Phoenician woman. Let's compare the response of the Jewish disciples of Jesus. Jesus, where in this desert place can we find bread? And look at the response of this Syrian Phoenician woman who is called a dog by the Jewish religious leadership of Jerusalem. Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And so you see, therefore, from the middle of Mark 7, where the metaphor of children's bread is brought up, now to the beginning of Mark 8, you will see that God is now blessing people to the extent that he blesses the Gentiles in Mark 8, and he's extending the children's bread to include children of other families. So if you read a little bit about Jewish complaints about the pagans, if you read literature in the first century, you'll find that one of the complaints of these barbaric pagans is that they go at their food without saying grace for the food. Because the Jews were taught right from the very beginning to say grace. And so when Jesus now separates the act of giving thanks for the bread from the act of giving thanks for the fish, Jesus is now teaching these new Gentile people in the crowd that you need to look up to heaven to say thank you to God for your food. We've done it for the bread, so now let's do it for the fish. And that's a reason why I feel that in Mark chapter 8, the giving thanks for the fish is separated from the giving thanks for the bread. Eating together is a sign of fellowship in the first century culture. You don't eat with your enemies. The Jews made it a practice not to eat with Gentiles in the first century. And so now, can you imagine this scene in the middle of the wilderness? There are Jews and non-Jews listening to Jesus. He's teaching them, he's healing them, he's casting out demons from them. He doesn't make any distinction between Jew or non-Jew. What is Jesus saying to these people here? He is saying the dividing wall between Jew and non-Jew is now broken down. You guys can now eat together. The children's bread is now extended to the children of other families. They found 7 loaves, and they ended with 7 basketfuls of leftover food. Why the number 7? Genesis 2, verse 2 to 3. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he has been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. 7 is God's number. 7 is a complete number. It signifies God's complete work. The Bible starts with God creating the heavens and the earth in 7 days and resting on the 7th day of creation. The Bible ends with 7 churches, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls, all in the book of Revelation. And so I wonder, by telling the story of 7 loaves for the 4,000 Jews and non-Jews together, and the 7 basketful loaves of leftover food, I wonder if now God is sending a message that in the crowd of 4,000 people, both Jew and non-Jew, we see a completion of God's work. He is establishing a new family for himself, in which Jew and non-Jew are included. I wonder if that's the subtle message Mark is trying to give in his account of Mark 8. I end with the story. Remember, some of you have only 5 loaves and 2 fish, and some of you have only 7 loaves. Story of John. When I was asked to lead a Bible study on the book of Romans, I immediately thought that I didn't have enough knowledge or experience. After a few weeks of study, lots of prayer, and some help from my pastor, I began to see that I could lead the study and make it worthwhile and interesting for the people who attended. Like me, many of us, when confronted with a task or asked to be in charge of a project, lament that we do not have enough help, enough money, enough time, or enough talent. The reaction of the disciples must have been similar when Jesus told them to feed a huge crowd of followers with only 7 loaves and a few small fish. I can see them looking at each other, maybe rolling their eyes and saying under their breath, "This will never be enough to feed all these people." Then, when thousands had eaten their fill and the leftovers were gathered up, the disciples must have been astonished. However, they also must have realized that this was simply another example of the unlimited power of their Lord. Sometimes we forget to consider this power. If we ask Christ for help in working for the kingdom, help is sure to come. With God, anything is possible. Instead, being discouraged when we think we don't have enough, we can decide, instead of being discouraged when we think we don't have enough, we can decide to be open to the miraculous power of the Holy Spirit. Let us bow our heads in prayer. I call upon Shauna and Brian to lead us in the final song. Close your eyes, bow your heads. Remember, you have only 5 loaves and 2 fish. Or in some situations, you only have 7 loaves. You have a limited amount of loaves in your life. And God is calling you to feed 4,000 people in 2015. An impossible task. But remember, you have the Holy Spirit with you, you have Jesus with you. And what does Jesus tell you to do? to sit down in the wilderness, to sit down in the remote place, to sit down in the desert and look up to heaven. Look up to heaven to feed the 4,000.